Good morning and welcome to our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Coming up today, Israel military releases video of ground operations in Gaza Strip. Families of hostages held by Hamas worry about Israeli ground operations in Gaza. Plus, UN Chief Antonio Guterres calls for humanitarian ceasefire and hostages released in Gaza. Thank you for joining us. The Israeli military released on Sunday footage of ground operations in the Gaza Strip, which included footage showing armored bulldozers operating in the area. Although the location or the date the videos were taken has not been independently verified, a number of Hamas operatives exiting a tunnel in Gaza near the Erez crossing were killed by Israeli forces, and 2 staging grounds of Hamas were taken out by its troops, according to the military on Sunday. That's the IDF. Palestinians in northern Gaza reported fierce air and artillery strikes early on Monday today, as Israeli troops, supported by tanks, pressed into the enclave with a ground assault. More videos were released by Israeli military today, footage of what it says were strikes it carried out on the Gaza Strip, where it said it was expanding its ground operations. The military said it killed dozens of terrorists who barricaded themselves in buildings and tunnels and attempted to attack the troops, adding that they struck 600 terror targets, including weapons depots, dozens of anti-tank missile launching positions, and hideouts and staging grounds used by Hamas. Israel began bombarding the Gaza Strip after the Islamist Hamas' devastating October 7 attack that killed at least 1,400 Israelis. Also today, Israeli military released footage of what it says were strikes it carried out on military infrastructure inside Syria. It said it was responding to launches from Syria towards Israeli territory earlier on Sunday. Concerns about the risk of a wider Middle East conflict have risen in recent days, with the U.S. dispatching more military assets to the region as Israel pummeled targets in Gaza and Hamas supporters in Syria and Lebanon. A group lobbying for the families of Israeli hostages held by Hamas insisted on Sunday that the safety of their loved ones should be a priority for the Israeli government as the military expanded ground operations in the Gaza Strip. At the headquarters of the Hostages and Missing Families Forum in Tel Aviv, 24-year-old Noam Allen, boyfriend of Inbar Hyman, who was kidnapped from a music festival, said ensuring the safety of all hostages and destroying Hamas are 2 conflicting goals that cannot be achieved together. Relatives of the hostages gathered outside the Israeli President Isaac Herzog's house in Jerusalem on Sunday, forming a human chain and holding up flyers with information and pictures of their kidnapped loved ones.
We know when we see that they are speaking about 2 goals for this operation. One is to bring all the hostages, and the second is to destroy Hamas. And as her boyfriend, I truly afraid that these 2 goals is like in conflict with each other. They cannot achieve together. I think that first the hostages should be free if it's by a deal to release all the Palestinian prisoners and to get all the hostages alive and safe.
I ask the authorities here and all the international community to keep pushing and to keep doing whatever they can. We need those people back home. My grandmother doesn't have the time to wait. She needs to be back home now. She's ill and she needs medication and she needs medical care. And we need to do everything now, today, to bring her back. I don't know how long can she survive.
Everyone are in sorrow, but we need to rush. We need to understand that time goes by. We have no clue. We are not political people or, military people. We are two simple people that try to save our sister, and we must tell the story as much as possible, and it doesn't matter in which way. Everybody can help.
Meanwhile, the Israeli military is renewing its call on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to evacuate southward, away from the main focus of the war against Hamas, now that it was urgent, according to them. The chief spokesperson, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, says, over the last 2 weeks, in his words, we have been calling on residents of the northern Gaza Strip and Gaza City to relocate southward temporarily. Relocating southward is for their personal safety. He said in a televised briefing that they are emphasizing that this is an urgent call. Hagari also added that the number of people confirmed held hostage in Gaza since Hamas' October 7 cross-border onslaught in southern Israel had risen to 239. Meanwhile, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres continues to call for immediate release of hostages in Gaza and a humanitarian ceasefire. Mr. Guterres was speaking to reporters during his visit to Kathmandu in Nepal, saying he reiterated his appeal for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, the unconditional release of all hostages, and the delivery of a sustained humanitarian relief at a scale that meets the needs of the people of Gaza. Aid supplies to Gaza have been choked since Israel began bombarding the densely populated Palestinian enclave in response to a deadly attack by its ruling group Hamas on October the 7th. Medical authorities in the Gaza Strip, which have a population of 2.3 million people, said on Sunday 8,005 people, including 3,324 minors, had been killed.
And I will continue to insist on the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages in Gaza. And I repeat my utter condemnation of the appalling attacks perpetrated by Hamas. There is no justification ever for the killing, injuring, and abduction of civilians. The situation in Gaza is growing more desperate by the hour. I regret that instead of a critically needed humanitarian pause supported by the international community, Israel has intensified its military operations. The number of civilians who have been killed and injured is totally unacceptable. All parties must respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. That law emerged from the tragedy and awful experiences of war. I've always been consistent in my call for strict compliance of the well-established principles and rule of international humanitarian law. The protection of civilians is paramount. The laws of war establish clear rules to protect human life and respect humanitarian concerns. Those laws cannot be contorted for the sake of expedience.
Speaking from Amman in Jordan, Juliet Tuma, the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency's Director of Communications, says Gazans are at breaking point as aid centers were looted over the weekend. Aid supplies to Gaza have been choked since Israel began bombarding the densely populated Palestinian enclave in response to the deadly attack by Hamas on October the 7th. Tuma says the UNRWA have been forced to reduce the scale of its humanitarian operation in the densely populated enclave because it could not distribute fuel to some medical facilities. She said the UNRWA had not received any additional supplies on Sunday. It said its ability to help people in Gaza have been completely stretched by airstrikes that have killed dozens of its staff and restricted the movement of supplies.
So we had thousands of people coming into one of the warehouses and food distribution centers in both Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah, so the middle areas, and Khan Yunis further south. And this happened yesterday during the day, and wheat flour was taken and other supplies like hygiene kits and cleaning material from our warehouses. This is an indication that people in Gaza have reached a breaking point. The levels of desperation, their frustration, their fear, their concern, they have been living under tight siege for more than 3 weeks. Bombardments continue. They have lost so much. They are grieving themselves. They have become displaced. So the levels of frustration and despair are really very high, and people are hitting rock bottom when it comes to their patience, their ability to take more. Yesterday there was no convoy. To date, Sunday the 29th of October, there has not been any supplies coming in. It's almost 7 p.m. local time. We have not gotten any supplies today. This could change, of course, during the coming hours. In general, those supplies are very, very little, and they don't correspond to the huge needs on the ground. We are asking for a standard and regular flow of supplies, of humanitarian supplies, including fuel, an increase in the number of trucks on these convoys, better system to bring in supplies and assistance to people in need in the Gaza Strip, and we're also calling for a ceasefire.
Joining us now is Dr. Tony Agbans, Senior Lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University in London, England. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning, Olumide.
Good morning. I think this is what is akin to what they call a catch-22 situation. Attack Hamas in the humanitarian criticized corridor of Gaza and be labeled someone who doesn't care about civilians, and continue to amass the killing of civilians because of your attack on Hamas, or refrain and be termed to not be hard enough against the Hamas terrorists who killed over 1,400 of your people, including women, including children, including the elderly. What are your initial reactions?
Yeah, thank you very much. You have put it very succinctly. It's a very perfect scenario, for a catch-22, like you said. I think for everyone that has been watching what has been playing out between Hamas and Israel in the last 23 days, is a case of, between the devil and the deep blue sea. Every day, we just see an escalation. Like you said, on October 7, when Hamas militias, when they attacked Israel, over 1,400 people were killed. A lot of them Israelis, and some other people from other nationalities who were, observing a festival somewhere, in southern Israel. So that actually, is the cause of this problem we are having. And as we speak, data available shows that over 8,000 Palestinians have been killed in retaliative offensive that the Israeli Defense Forces, have been on. Airstrikes, drone attacks, and even yesterday, listening to the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, he is saying that they are now going for the final push, which is the ground offensive. And the UN aid agencies are all saying that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza along the Strip now is getting out of hand. And there was even an attack on a food warehouse in Gaza, over the weekend. So it is just so sad that as we speak, over 9,400 people have been killed, many injured, a lot are still being held hostage. So in situating this crisis that is going on, again, we look at the laws of cause and effect, both from the Israeli side and also from the Gaza side, the Hamas. So that is the problem we are having at the moment.
I notice you call them Hamas militia and not Hamas terrorists. Are they militants? Are they a militia? Or are they terrorists that invaded, that attacked Israel?
I think the Israelis call them terrorists. In the West here, they call them terrorists. But it's a question of semantics. So either way, they are a resistance force.
Right. Let's move on to the issue concerning the hostages. Over the weekend, Hamas says that at the weekend that 50 hostages have been killed as a result of the airstrikes and the bombardment by Israeli IDF forces. Now, we don't know the identity of those hostages that have been killed. They call them captives. According to them, they say 50 captives have been killed. We can only safely assume they're talking about the hostages. So if 50 hostages have been killed, could you react to this, given in mind that at the beginning of this conflict, Hamas had threatened that for every Israeli airstrike, they will kill a hostage?
Yeah, I think when that report came in about the killing of 50 hostages, there have been a lot of dissent. A lot of people feel that probably Hamas, they are just trying to use propaganda. They are the ones doing the killing. But some other school of thought also feel that it is also possible that during the strikes by the Israeli defense forces, this is when these hostages were killed. But my instinct tells me that it's propaganda. That is I'm just speaking instinctively. I don't believe Hamas will be so daft to just put these hostages in harm's way. They probably keep them in some bunker below the surface of the earth somewhere. Because
you think
these
they're lying that the hostages are not dead, that the hostages are the 50 hostages are alive? You think that's a lie? You think they're alive?
I think they may be alive or they may be killed. It's a very dicey scenario. We cannot really put a handle on it.
The World Health Organization, Dr. Agwon, the World Health Organization said that that's the World Health Organization have appealed to Hamas that it should give proof of life of the hostages. Is that a fair demand? So that we know how many people are alive, how many people are not alive. Israel says 239 now, and that number keeps changing, that were kidnapped. 4 have been released. Hamas has said that 50 have perished. Proof of life from the World Health Organization.
Exactly. There has to be proof of life. And you see what Hamas also did very tactically. They released about 4 hostages. And in hostage situation, you release some to go and tell the story. And you saw how those hostages, they spoke to the world press. So it whips up sentiment. You saw the meeting Netanyahu had with the families of hostages yesterday. So all these are, in hostage situation, you have to bargain. I think Hamas is bargaining. And let me just put this one very clearly. The Hamas group have said they will only release over 200 hostages if Israel releases, over 6,000 of, I think some reports say 6,000, some say 8,000 of Hamas group members who are in different prisons in Israel. They are in Israeli jails. But Israel is having a second thought because in 2011, Israel released one of their soldiers, Gilad Shalit, for just one soldier, for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And Israel have said that was, a tactical error, that they are not going to do that again, in the spirit of proportionality. And Israelis are really, really hesitant this time around. They don't want to release over 6,000, 7,000 hostages because of 230. But there's pressure on the Israeli government to accede to the request of Hamas over this hostage situation. So that is the situation at the moment.
Before we leave the hostage situation, where I want us to delve into the crisis in Gaza and the thousands of people that have been killed there, Hamas had a delegation over at Russia, we understand now, and Hamas said that in response to a Russian request, they were going to release 4 Israeli-Russian nationals. A number of Israeli-Russian nationals, I think about 7 or 8 of them, under 10, at least I know that number. They were going to release them. They said, and I'm quoting the Hamas operative, he said that they will look for the hostages, that it will be difficult, but they will see to releasing the Israeli-Russian national hostages, that they would look for them. If you heard that report, what do you make of it? They would look for them. Don't they know where they are? Isn't there a tally of when all the hostages were taken, where they are, what nationalities they are? That would have been in keeping with any organization's organization on how to keep such hostages that you've taken. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, again, these are some of the secrecy, some information that are not available in the public domain. But Olumide, when you look at the Israeli Defense Forces, you look at the architecture of the Israeli military. They work so much on intelligence, although they didn't see the attack that happened on October 7, that aside. So I believe they may not make this publicly. The Israelis, they know the identity of the people that are taken. You know the security situation between Israel and Palestine. Report have it that the Israeli nation is one of the most security conscious nation on earth, because anything can happen. In the blink of an eye, there could be crisis, in Israel or in Palestine. So they know, they actually know this, but this back and forth, the Hamas group, this is my thinking, they are using these hostages to kind of, slow down the ground incursion that Israel wants to do. Because at the end of the day, if Israel, because many people actually thought that the ground offensive would have taken place. This is day 23, would have taken place already. So why the delay? So I believe that if this hostage situation was not there, that ground offensive would have been done already. So all this back and forth we are seeing in the media, both from the Israeli and the Hamas side, is a kind of juggle, puzzle-solving military tactics, especially from the Hamas, to slow down this ground offensive. But looking at the tense language of the defense chief of Israel, over the weekend, I think the Israelis are going all out. But there is pressure at home. Families are calling on the Israeli authorities to be very cautious and not just go for this all-out ground attack. Because at the end of the day, I think lives will still be lost.
Where does that leave Russia? Where Russia at the United Nations and the Security Council is putting itself in a position where it seems to be supporting Hamas? And Hamas, on the other hand, and I repeat, they said that they are going to look for the Israeli-Russian hostages, meaning that they don't know where they are or that it's difficult for them to find them. It seems pretty mysterious.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. The Hamas, the hostages are with them. They've released about 4. They are promising to release about 7 or 8, as soon as possible. So they know where the hostages are. This is all bargain. And like I said, it's an attempt to slow down the ground offensive, which Israel probably want to do this week. So it is all military tactics. And we watch and see how this will pan out. For Russia, I think the Russians have been doing a lot of, shuttle diplomacy, trying to see how they can resolve the crisis. But a major disadvantage for the Russians is that at this point in time, they are not really in good terms with the West. So there's no synergy from that angle because of the crisis which Russia themselves have with Ukraine. So there is no really direct discussions and conversations between Russia and leaders of Western nations. And let's not forget the UN Security Council 15-member, they be trying to come up with resolutions on this crisis, but I think the US vetoed, and they are not really having a headway. Today, as we speak, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, who are the only Arab nation in the UN Security Council, they are bringing up a resolution for a humanitarian pause so that people can get succor and get aid during this crisis. I think food they say, is running out in Gaza and the Gaza Strip.
Okay, Dr. Agbans, finally, the Palestinians have lost 8,005 people. That's 8,005, including 3,324 children as a result of this conflict. Mr. Guterres of the United Nations, the Secretary General, had mentioned that he is also calling for a humanitarian pause. He is also calling for a release of the hostages, that it is appalling that the situation in Gaza continues to be dire. Your final thoughts?
Yeah, the UN Secretary General, he's been really calling, although for a humanitarian truce, but his speech at the United Nations during a meeting upset Israel and some Western nations. So there have been a lot of disenchantment, with him in particular, as most of them feel that he's taking sides. But on the whole, I think
was that a fair judgment on Mr. Guterres? Do you think he could be handling it more delicately, more diplomatically, so that both sides could? Okay.
Yeah, it could have been more sensitive, because I listened to that speech. As a senior diplomat, somebody that leads the administration of the United Nations, should have been a bit more sensitive in his address. Although what he said, they were germane, they were the truth, but already there's a crisis on hand. He could have been more tactical in his presentation. So hopefully, a ceasefire will be called and peace will be on the horizon.
Amen. We thank you, Dr. Tony Agbans, Senior Lecturer, Anglia-Ruskin University, London, for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Coming up, Palestinians storm the UN warehouse for food supplies amidst continuous Israeli siege over Gaza. Please stay with us. Welcome to the second stretch of Israel-Hamas war on Channels Television. As we mentioned earlier, it appears patience is wearing thin as thousands of Gazan residents broke into warehouses and distribution centers of the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency, grabbing flour and basic survival items. In Khan Yunis, Gazans were seen carrying boxes and bags of food aid in front of a warehouse in the city on Saturday. Aid supplies to Gaza have been choked since Israel began bombarding the densely populated Palestinian enclave in response to a deadly attack by Hamas on October the 7th. The UNRWA said that its ability to help people in Gaza has been completely stretched by airstrikes that have killed more than 50 of its staff and restricted the movement of supplies. Even before the conflict, the organization had said its mandate was being jeopardized due to a lack of funding. Established in 1949 following the First Arab-Israeli War, the UNRWA provides public services including schools, primary health care, and humanitarian aid in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Now, the White House says it sees no evidence that the family of an Al Jazeera journalist in Gaza were targeted and killed by Israel in response to the network's coverage in the region. Al Jazeera claims the wife, son, and daughter of one of its correspondents in Gaza killed on Wednesday night in an Israeli airstrike that the Hamas-run Enclave Health Ministry said killed at least 25 people. There was no immediate comment from the Israeli military on the strike, which the network claimed hit the area where Wael al-Dadu's family had fled to, following an Israeli warning about a Gaza ground incursion. Al Jazeera reported other members of Dadu's family were buried under the rubble. The network broadcast live footage of his family, crying as he saw family members laying lifeless in hospital.
On September 25th, my dad, my 20-year-old brother, and 4 of my uncles, who are all U.S. citizens, went to visit our family in Gaza. Despite my mother's pleadings otherwise, my dad promised my mom it was safe and that they would be back in a month. It was my dad's first trip back home in over 20 years and my brother's first trip out of the country as an adult. 2 weeks into their vacation, the attack started and they are no longer safe. Now, our conversations have shifted from daily vacation updates to proof of life updates. We hold our breath every day, waiting to hear from our family, to hear that they made it through Israel's airstrikes, to see another day. My family and I have been contacting anyone we could think of, congressmen, senators, the embassies in the U.S., Jerusalem, and Egypt. They've all told us they are not doing anything to rescue the Palestinian Americans in Gaza. Why do the Israeli Americans get rescued? Why are the Palestinian Americans being ignored? In this moment, I want to take the time to call for an immediate end to the violence aimed at Palestinians. We're begging for our world leaders to do something and end the violence and apartheid in Palestine.
The president doesn't believe that targeting journalists at all in any way is appropriate, but I can't speak to the specifics of that case. I've seen the reporting, and certainly our thoughts and prayers go out to his family. I mean, that's just horrible. But I can't speak to the circumstances in which that strike occurred. But make no mistake, the president believes strongly in what you all do for a living and how you need to be able to do that freely and securely. And we know that all of you take great risks sometimes in doing that job. So you're asking me in the context of like that we have some kind of beef with Al Jazeera? Yes. I'll let the secretary and their staff speak to his conversations in the region. I won't do that. We recognize Al Jazeera as a valuable voice and an outlet that has incredible reach in the region and beyond. I don't need to tell you that. It's truly a global network, and we value the work that you do.
One quick question, just because the Committee to Protect Journalists says that at least 24 journalists have been killed in Gaza trying to cover this story. Are you concerned that Israel is trying to silence journalists who are trying to tell both sides of this story, including our Al Jazeera Arabic bureau chief?
I've not seen any indication whatsoever that Israel was going after journalists, in particular because of them trying to tell the story. I've seen absolutely zero evidence of that. That's an unfounded allegation.
Of course, United States official John Kirby. Joining us now is Dr. Ambrose Woke, Chairman, Guild of Public Affairs Analysts, Enugu Chapter. You're welcome to the program. Good morning.
Good morning, Olumide, and thank you for having me once more.
It's our pleasure. I think to begin, it would be remiss of me and us not to express our sincere condolences to the Al Jazeera journalists and their family concerning the death of their loved ones in this conflict that we've just shown the reaction from the family member of the Al Jazeera journalist and also from the United States answering questions on that particular incident. And also not just that particular case, but other innocent lives lost in this conflict, not to mention everyone who is grieving for their loved ones on both sides, as well as those praying for the return of their hostages. Do you think that Israel is deliberately targeting journalists who are covering the war in a manner they think is favorable to Hamas? That was a question posed to Mr. John Kirby in that presser.
Yes. Well, I will align myself with Mr. Covey. I don't agree with that journalists are targeted. It's an unfounded propaganda which should stop immediately. When the airstrikes happen, I don't think there's any precision technology for now that identifies the type of profession a human being does from air. The precision technologies we have now, I can only cite moving figures, can only cite human beings, can only be precise against physical targets. But that we have, precision technology that can identify the kind of work or profession one does from air is not available for now. So it is unfounded and grossly unfounded. And I'm surprised a journalist is making that statement because over the years, we in the journalism profession have paid the supreme price in many occasions for wars. I mean, all over the years, even in the Biafra Nigerian war, some journalists were killed, both foreign and local. We have had in the Second World War, many journalists were killed. The civil war in Vietnam between America and the other Cold Wars. In fact, even in a non-war situation, because of the Cold War of philosophy between the East Bloc and West Bloc in those days, so journalists have been assassinated over the years. Even recently, Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian American journalist, is one of the most recent cases of even journalists that have been assassinated in peacetime. Our own Dele Giwa of Newswatch, even Godwin Agroko of I think Guardian newspaper, and so many journalists have paid the supreme price even in peacetime. Talk less of wartime. So it's one of the dangers of practicing journalism, where journalists have been targets all over the world. In a war situation, especially in an asymmetrical warfare like what is happening between Gaza and Israel, where they are not defined war fronts per se, like what is happening between Ukraine and Russia, there are identifiable war fronts, for example, where regions are being captured, soldiers go to war, border disputes, and other things that happen around the world, where there are actually identified war fronts. But in this case, in asymmetrical warfare that's going on in Gaza, there are no defined fronts, and especially in a situation where Israel has been accusing Hamas of actually setting military bases in civilian locations. Even they have accused Hamas of using hospitals, of using schools, of using markets, and even religious places as targets, and rockets emanating from them. So somehow Israel sees some of these civilian locations and are arguing that some of these civilian locations are actually military locations used by Hamas. So that is also something that has to be found out, so that human casualties, especially civilians, can be left out of war. Wars, usually conventional wars, have to find fronts. But when you start pounding from the air, just like what Israel is doing, accusing Hamas of using civilian base there, there are a lot of collateral damage. So I think what has happened to that Jazeera reporter is part of the collateral damage of the war and one of the hazards of practicing journalism.
Indeed, very painful and heartbreaking to that family, for him. Reuters journalists also lost their lives sometime earlier, about 2 weeks ago, in this 3-week conflict. What do you make of the situation between Israel and Turkey now, where Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, talked about Israel as being occupiers and saying that Hamas were freedom fighters and they were not a terrorist organization. In response, Israel has recalled its envoy to Turkey.
I don't think anyone has been a friend of the style of leadership of Netanyahu. He has been very vehement in his speech, and I think he's also a fearless fellow. We must give it to Right Rabbi Erdogan. He doesn't, he's not afraid. He speaks out, and that also it goes to show the power of his country in the politics, diplomacy in the Middle East and in Europe. Turkey is strategically placed as a gateway between Europe and the Middle East. So, and over the years, Turkey has played that role very, very well. Balance of power, and it has also wrapped up his military power, diplomatic power, and economic power. So Turkey is not afraid to speak his mind in things like this, and the president has made it very clear. But I disagree with the president of Turkey in what he has just said, because when you see freedom fighters fighting for whose freedom, it has been brought out most eloquently by media houses that even the leaders of Hamas that proclaim to fighting for freedom and emancipation of Palestinians, that their own families are not even in Palestine, but to go back. And many of them don't even live in Palestine. They live in UAE, and their children school in the best schools in Europe and United States. And if that is true, then we need to question what is really, when you say fighting for freedom. Freedom of who? Would you fight for freedom for a people who are endangering their lives? Look at what is happening in Gaza. Over 8,000 people have been killed already, and we are told that over 3,000 children have been killed. I mean, this is one of the worst in history. In a particular month, that a number, in fact, sometimes in a year, number of children like that have not been killed in conflicts around the whole world. Then we are talking about one location. And so if you say you are fighting for freedom and you're going to kill other people in their own country, slaughter their own children, their women, adults, young people, and in the name of freedom, fighting for freedom. And those people have the capability to also reply and respond in forceful ways, and you are losing your own people every day. I don't know what kind of freedom fighting is that. So I will not say Hamas is a freedom fighting organization. We had PLO those days, Palestinian Liberation Organization. We have a government in Palestine. And those are the legitimate people that will feel that we will say that they're fighting for the freedom of the Palestinian people. And as we always say, I'm a chartered mediator myself, and we always say it's always good to have peace than to war, because every war always ends up in the negotiation table. So it's always good to have Georgia than to war. Because when you are fighting for freedom, there are ways to fight for freedom. Let's take the example of Mahatma Gandhi those days when he was fighting for the liberation of India from the British colonialism. Even some African countries and some other people. I mean, everything was done in peace talk. Although there were some insurrections, there were some civil disobedience, and some other things. These are ways to fight for freedom. But when you now go to attack other countries, attack other cities, slaughter other people, and when there's a retaliation on your people, killing your own people in large numbers, that is not freedom. There should be a line between freedom and terrorism. In as much as sometimes Western countries tend to brand people who are not aligning with their philosophy as terrorists, and as we have seen in the case of, for example, African National Congress, ANC, in the days of apartheid. But that does not also, free the option. That does not always absolve people who are practicing terrorism. For example, ANC, without even killing anybody, was branded a terrorism organization. That we know it was a white lie and was a propaganda. But in the case of people who now carry arms and go kill other people, invade their countries, kidnap people, and slaughter people, that has crossed the boundary of freedom fighting to terrorism. And Hamas should appropriately be termed the terrorist organization and not freedom fighters.
A humanitarian pause has been called for by the European Union by all and sundry. This is happening while the IDF had said that it is ramping up its operations, and they've entered their second phase of operations. We've seen the ground incursion into Gaza over the weekend. Some described it as hell on earth. One of the nights, the night that the communications of the Gazans was totally cut off, and there was a blackout in communications, and no one could get a phone call out or in. But that seems to have been restored to some degree as at today and yesterday. For the humanitarian pause to be respected, that is being called for by Israel, what do you think needs to happen?
Let me begin with what ought to have happened. At the early days of this retaliation, when after October 7th, when Israel started their pounding, they did give an ultimatum to residents of Gaza to vacate Gaza because they want to start military operations there. And the world kept quiet then. That was when actions were supposed to be taken. that was when the Western nations and all these people having votes of no confidence, having resolutions and the rest, supposed to, talk to Israel and see how they can open a corridor for people to actually leave Gaza, because Israel was bent on retaliating. And it was very clear that nobody, no UN resolution, nobody in the world was ready to stop them. So we would have, enter that time and be able to make many Gazans live as many of them to leave Gaza as possible. But paradoxically and curiously, most of the neighbors refused to open their gates to have Palestinians coming from Gaza. Egypt closed its border. Most of them closed their border. And it's even intriguing that the Hamas told their people not to leave. How can you tell your people not to leave a danger zone? How can you tell your people not to leave an incoming, disaster zone when Israel has made it clear that it was going to retaliate? And they were saying, so the one would have told Israel, your time you gave was too short. Why not give a window of maybe more days and weeks so that people can actually leave Gaza before you start your military operation? But we didn't do that, and then the world waited for the bombs to start dropping. Then the neighboring countries, all of them closed their borders and left the people trapped in there. And even it took a lot of time before even Egypt allowed aid to start crossing from the Rafah crossing into Gaza. These are all complicated situations, and it makes it clear that Israel is not only the culprit in terms of this access of humanitarian services to the people of Gaza. The neighboring countries were also part of it. I mean, it took a very long while before Egypt could open the Rafah crossing, and so many. Many of them still close their borders till today. So it made it difficult for the humanitarian assistance to come in, and also the people of Gaza to leave. Then what should happen from now on? Having made that mistake, I think other countries surrounding, neighboring countries surrounding Gaza and Israel should now be made to see how they can also bring in aid from there. But both sides are even afraid. The neighboring countries are afraid that Hamas terrorist commanders and fighters may cross over to their own countries and start causing problems for them. Israel is also saying that Hamas fighters may join the civilians to escape. So it's a very delicate and complicated situation that has to take the persuasion of the United States, because the United States is the big brother to Israel, and it has a lot to do with Israel, and Israel listens to it. Because, for example, the communication that was restored to Gaza was done by a phone call from President Biden and the U.S. officials who, impressed it on, Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, to, restore power communications there, and they were able to do that just in a matter of days. So if U.S. can be convinced also to see how they can call for this humanitarian truce, putting everything in place and making sure that both fears of both the neighboring countries and Israel is also, assuaged, then I think we can have progress in that direction.
Do you get a sense of a psychological dimension to this conflict, that on October the 7th, the Israelis were invaded in such a manner and suffered such terrible losses, only akin to maybe the days of the Vikings or Attila the Hun or the worst type of ISIS attack, and then had their people taken into Gaza, and that they feel like maybe like a bear robbed of her cubs, and that maybe, for instance, the unconditional release of the hostages that are alive would help to give Hamas a case that they are in a position to have dialogue and for peace to return to the Gaza Strip.
It is very clear that Hamas does not want peace. And it's very clear also that the Palestinian people want peace. On the other hand, so who should the world be listening to? The world should not be listening to Hamas. The world should be concerned about the Palestinian people. But again, it goes to ask, what do the Palestinian people living in Gaza actually want? Because there seems to be complication and paradox in the assertions being made. Why some people are hailing Hamas as freedom fighters, as liberators. The Israelis don't see them as what you have described. Going into a country and slaughtering these people, in another country and then thinking you get away with it. It's not how to go about it. So it is very clear on both sides that something needs to be done. But the way we are doing this now is that Hamas doesn't want peace. United Nations should work more with Palestinian people and Mahmoud Abbas. And some, ideas have been coming in, suggestions have been coming about how to hand over Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and that Gaza part being administered by Hamas back to the Palestinian government led by Mahmoud Abbas. I think doing that will be a lot better and will help to calm nerves, because Hamas, I think, his work there is to destabilize the peace of the Middle East. And they have been doing that very comfortably. Some have suggested that because of the imminent ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that is why Hamas struck, because they wanted to put that on hold, they didn't want that to happen.
We'll leave it there.
And it seems that Hamas always wants war what's to happen in that Middle East. Maybe they gain from it. But all hands must be on deck to ensure that this thing is, stamped out immediately so that peace can return in that region and people can stop losing their lives.
Indeed. We thank you so much for your insight and contribution this morning. Dr. Ambrose Igboke, Chairman of the Guild of Public Affairs Analysts, Enugu Chapter. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Olumide, for having me.
Thousands of supporters of Pakistan's biggest Islamist party, Jamaat-e-Islam, marched through the streets of Islamabad on Sunday and rallied in support of Palestine. Participants of the Gaza march turned the streets into a sea of Palestinian flags, chanting anti-Israeli slogans and urging the Pakistani government to support Palestine. Wake up, and go stand beside them. They are our brothers, so they said. Israel is expanding ground operations in Gaza, and its fighter jets struck hundreds of more Hamas targets, the Israeli military said on Sunday, in what Prime Minister Netanyahu has called the second phase of the 3-week-old war. Telephone and internet communications were partially restored in Gaza after more than a day-long blackout that had badly impacted rescue operations as Israel pounded targets of the Hamas group that controls the territory. And Pope Francis on Sunday called for a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas and renewed an appeal for the release of the hostages held by the terrorists in Gaza. He says, let no one abandon the possibility of stopping the weapons, he said at a weekly blessing in St. Peter's Square. Ceasefire, he says, mentioning a recent appeal by Father Ibrahim Faltas, one of the Vatican's representatives in the Holy Land. He then added in his own words, we say ceasefire, ceasefire. Brothers and sisters, stop. War is always a defeat, always. Referring to the grave situation in Palestine and Israel. He said in Gaza in particular, let there be room to guarantee humanitarian aid and may the hostages be freed immediately. Pope Francis spoke as Israeli forces waged ground operations against Hamas in Gaza in what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calls the second phase. And that's our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war this morning. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide McCauley.